Taiwan is by far the most dangerous issue in U.S.-China relations because if Taiwan declares independence, China will declare war.
一本护照能决定一个民族的命运，台湾一旦宣布独立，手中这本护照将从通行180个国家暴跌到只剩5个到10个。马凯硕教授，新加坡著名外交家，前联合国安理会主席，这位纵横世界政坛数十年的智者，说出了让台独人士完全窒息的真相。那些在岛内鼓吹台湾共和国的人，那些高喊独立、煽动民粹的台独精英，把独立说得天花乱坠，口口声声说民主、说自由，却对普通台湾人要付出的代价只字不提。他们拿美国当靠山，把台湾当棋子，把2300万台湾人推向深不见底的悬崖，话说的冠冕堂皇，算盘却打得阴险至极。没想到偏偏是这位外国学者在镜头前把谎言一刀戳破。更让人热血沸腾的是，他还说出了中国战略布局深层的高明之处，为什么不急，为什么必胜，为什么时间始终站在中国这边。让我们来看马凯硕教授说了什么。
We do know the 21st century, certainly Asia's century, with the emergence of China and India. And certainly I think it's almost going back to what it used to be, because China certainly was the biggest economy in the world, several hundred years ago, and then it went down, and now it's the revitalization of China. Let's get into talking about China and specifically the U.S.-China relationship. I'd love to get your thoughts on what are some of the biggest misunderstandings that you see from Washington, from policymakers in regards to China, and how do you see this rivalry between the U.S. and China playing out in 2026?
Well, by the way, you're right about your statistics also about China and India, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 after the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India.
Correct.
So by the middle of the century, we are going back to the historical norm. So it's not unnatural. It's a natural development. But of course, now we have a third power in the world, which is United States. And certainly the United States, one must never underestimate the United States. It has a formidable economy, and even today still has the world's largest economy. So one must always treat the United States with great respect. But at the same time, 2025 produced many geopolitical surprises. But probably the biggest surprise was that China, and in the case of China, as you know, China has gone through hell the last 200 years.
Right.
And it suffered a century of humiliation from the First Opium War of 1842 to 1949, when the PRC was established. So after 200 years, essentially, of being bullied around, pushed around, finally, in 2025, China was finally able to push back against a peer power, the United States, and say, if you can hurt me, I can hurt you. So China's decision to cut off the supply of rare earths and magnets could have really done enormous damage to the American economy. And that's why, surprisingly, even though the year began, as you know, remember the tariffs in April and May, where tariffs on China went up to 145%. By the end of the year, both sides had reached a truce. And I can tell you, as someone who's written a book on U.S.-China relations, it's right behind me, has China One, I did not expect this at all. I didn't expect that China would now be strong enough to push back. So paradoxically, at a time when the rest of the world is going to experience turbulence for sure, but on the China-US front, you might actually have a relatively stable year, because President Donald Trump, surprisingly, is a realist. When he hits a wall, he doesn't keep knocking his head against a wall. He understands that China today is in a position to push back. And so, as he said, after the last meeting in South Korea, that he's going to visit China in April.
Correct.
And so you might actually see some stability in the US-China front.
I really like that answer because that's an interesting analysis that we've done as well. Is last year when the tariff war started, all countries were hit with tariffs, and many countries aren't able to push back. For example, my wife's from Canada. Canada doesn't have that leverage against the United States. They just can't fight back. But we did see China actually stand tall. China actually responded with retaliatory tariffs. So when it went to 100, China said 100. When it went to 150, China replied with 150 until it really escalated. And then Trump had to reverse it because the US and China, they naturally have to work together. So it's a really important message that you said, is that Trump is a realist. He realized that, hey, China does have some cards. They do have a lot of leverage over us. And, it was great to see.
By the way, just for the record, China didn't just respond with tariffs. As I mentioned, actually stopped raising it above 100% because it said frankly above 100% it doesn't matter.
Right. It's correct.
Trade just stopped. So they didn't try to match 145, but they reacted, as you know, with the cutting of the supplies of rare earths and magnets, and that really hurt.
Yes, that was a very big one. Professor, I want to talk about the United States and its foreign policy, because last year we saw something very interesting happen. We saw the United States actually release a new national security strategy where it said that it was going to be retreating from Asia. It now does not consider Russia and China a primary threat. And of course, we've seen the United States now focus more on its own sphere of influence. It's certainly looking like it's going to have a lot more power in the Western Hemisphere. We saw, obviously, the United States go after Maduro in Venezuela. We've seen Donald Trump make threats to Colombia, to Cuba, even Mexico, and certainly the annexation of Greenland, which he has threatened, although that seems to be a deal now in place with Denmark that satisfies the president. Do you see the world splitting into these different spheres of influence? For example, China's going to have the sphere of Asia. The United States is going to primarily stay on its side of the world. Do you see the world fragmenting like that for the future?
Well, I think, the world of spheres of influence is very much like a 19th century world, which I don't think you can recreate in the 21st century, because countries in general have a lot more agency, and countries in the world don't want to be trapped in spheres of influence. So, for example, let's take South America, where there's an effort to revive the Monroe Doctrine. Certainly, the United States will remain the militarily the strongest power in South America. No question.
No question.
But every country in South America, including the good friend of the United States, Argentina, does more trade with China today than it does with the US. And you cannot ask countries to sacrifice their income and well-being just for sphere of influence reasons.
Correct.
And similarly, if you look south of China, in Southeast Asia where I live, the ASEAN countries certainly have increased their trade with China significantly. In fact, last year, by the way, China-ASEAN trade exceeded $1 trillion, possibly making it the world's largest trading relationship, $1 trillion. But at the same time, Southeast Asia has far more American investment than Chinese investment. In fact, the United States has invested more in the 10, now 11 ASEAN countries than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, and India combined.
Wow.
So clearly, the United States too has a very strong economic and political footprint in Southeast Asia. So just as South America is not going to easily become a sphere of influence of the United States of America, I don't see Southeast Asia becoming a sphere of influence of China either. So countries will always try to keep all their options open. And it'll be, and I want to emphasize one word that many in the West don't seem to understand, that the world of tomorrow is a very complex world, far more active greatest in the world. And the global south, by the way, who make up 88% of the world's population, are not going to be happily join any spheres of influence. They want to keep their options open and be friends with everybody.
Yeah, I think it's a good policy because, we live in this global economy. I think it's good for all countries to do business. For example, I always say, we would want to do business with China and the United States. They're the top two economies in the world, right? If you're a smaller nation, one of these middle powers, as the Canadian Prime Minister said, your option is always going to be the best to do work with both and, try to find a way to work together, to coexist. Professor, let's talk about China specifically. A big headline coming in right now is that last year the trade surplus is over $1 trillion, 1.2 trillion, I believe. Do you believe that this is a problem for China? Do you think that, I want to get your expectations for the Chinese economy and kind of how China's moving forward in 2026? What are your thoughts on China specifically?
Well, the story of the Chinese economy is a mixed one. Certainly domestically, the Chinese economy is growing, but not growing very fast. Consumer sentiment is down. The real estate bubble hasn't been fixed. So on the domestic front, the economy is slowed down significantly. But on the external front, the Chinese economy has clearly become far more competitive and therefore, as you know, has a record trade surplus of over $1 trillion. But I think the Chinese leaders are sophisticated enough to understand that if China just keeps exporting a lot without importing a lot, that will create a political backlash against China, right? Countries will say, excuse me, I have to protect my jobs too. So therefore, it is in China's national interests to try to actually import more goods from the rest of the world. And they have taken, to be fair to them, they have taken some concrete steps. So at a time when the United States removed all the tariff concessions given to the African countries, China gave all the African countries zero tariffs, and also to the least developing countries, zero tariffs. And I was in Shanghai 2 months ago, and I discovered that China is the only country in the world that organizes something called the China International Import Exposition. So they have an exposition that invites countries to come and say, come and tell us what you want to sell and we'll import it. Now, I do believe that the Chinese domestic economy will bounce back, that consumer sentiment, positive consumer sentiment will come back. And I do believe that China will eventually have the world's largest consumer market. And if the world's largest consumer market also starts to import far more goods from the rest of the world, then that will be good for China and that will be good for the rest of the world. Correct. So right now, what we are seeing in this massive trade surplus, I think is an aberration because there's a limit to what other countries can accept in terms of having a massive bilateral deficit with China.
Yes, I think that's good. And Professor, we've actually seen China respond to this. Even at the Davos, for example, the Chinese leader who gave a speech said, we want to make sure that we're going to be the world's factory, but we also want to be the world's market. And we do want to welcome, more goods and services from other countries. And that's a very interesting point, the international import exposition, that China is the only country that actually has that, to focusing on that. I think it's a good thing for China. I want to get your thoughts on, let's talk about kind of, I would say the biggest issue would certainly be Taiwan and how I'd like to get your thoughts on the China-Taiwan situation. It does seem that a lot of the rhetoric that started at the beginning of the year was if Donald Trump, makes a move on Venezuela, or if he takes Greenland, what signal does that send to China? Is Taiwan at risk? I'd like to get your thoughts on the most crucial aspect of the U.S.-China relationship, which is, of course, the island of Taiwan.
Well, I would say that much of the Western commentary on Taiwan is either simplistic or ignorant. Sadly. I mean, it's amazing that you can have some very sophisticated international newspapers like the New York Times or the Economist, and they engage in very facile thinking when they discuss an issue like China and Taiwan.
Right.
It must be emphasized that there's no question that Taiwan is by far the most dangerous issue in US-China relations, because if Taiwan declares independence, China will declare war. And Taiwan, by the way, is the last living symbol of the century of humiliation, because Taiwan was separated from China when China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So having the goal of reunification is absolute. China will never falter in that goal. But at the same time, the Chinese have clearly the most sophisticated geopolitical minds in the world. So if you see a ripe fruit on a tree, and if it's about to fall off, why go all out to go and look for a long sword to cut it off? It's going to fall into your lap.
Right.
And over time, the Chinese believe that time is on their side. And if China becomes the world's biggest market, as you and I mentioned earlier, if you ask countries around the world to choose, hey, do you want to support China or do you want to support Taiwan? Of course, they'll say, I want to support China.
Right.
Who's going to support Taiwan? In fact, when I was in Taiwan last year, I spoke to the Taiwanese. I said, listen, you're very lucky you have a passport called Republic of China. Because if you threw away the Republic of China passport, which gives you access to 180 countries, and you replace it with the Republic of Taiwan passport, you'll be lucky if you get access to 5 to 10 countries. Nobody's going to recognize Republic of Taiwan passport. So time is therefore on China's side. So there's no reason for China to rush the process. But at the same time, the Chinese also want to send a clear message to the Taiwanese, because the current president of Taiwan is known to be someone who's pro-independence. He knows the population of Taiwan is not for independence, but he's pro-independence. But to send a message to him, the Chinese conduct very powerful military exercises around Taiwan to say, don't even think about it. And in some ways, those massive Chinese military exercises are actually very useful as a reminder to everybody, to the Taiwanese and to the Americans, because there are some Americans, frankly, who are trying to, behind the scenes promote independence of Taiwan and so on and so forth. They have to think twice whether it's in their interests to do so. So overall, I remain confident that there'll be no war over Taiwan.
Very good. Very good. I agree with that assessment entirely.
看完这场对话，我沉默了很久，不是因为震惊，而是一种复杂的感慨。一个新加坡人，一个外国人，竟然把中国战略的本质说得比许多人都透彻。我把马凯硕教授这番话反复听了好几遍，他说的最直白的一句是他亲口对台湾人说的：你现在拿的是中华民国护照，这本护照通行180个国家，一旦换成台湾共和国护照，能进的国家5个到10个都不到。没有任何人会承认那本护照，这不是威胁，这是外交现实的冷酷逻辑。在我们看来，这就是政治学上所谓零和博弈最讽刺的版本。台独精英以为换个名字就能换个新天地，就能获得国际承认，但你把中华民国4个字扔掉，你失去的是几代人积累下来的外交遗产，是180个国家的互信，是你在这个世界上生存的根基。这不叫走向新时代，这叫自废武功。我再打个更接地气的比喻，一家老字号的店，招牌在全城人人认识，生意虽不算红火，但还过得去。这时候来了个所谓的顾问，说把这块老招牌换掉吧，换了新名字才彰显个性。店主真的照做了，结果客人全走光了，因为没有人认识这家新店。这就是台湾共和国若真的出现在国际社会最真实的命运。再说军事这一块，数字不说谎，2015年中国海军舰艇总吨位95万吨，到了2024年飙升到230万吨，首次超越美国海军，成为全球吨位最大的海军兼20隐身战机的年产量，从个位数提升到每年40架以上东风21D和东风26也能在第一、第二岛链之内对美国航母战斗群精准打击。这意味着美军介入台海的代价每一年都在急剧攀升，从可以承受到难以承受，到根本不敢轻易承受。那很多人要问了，军事力量既然这么强，为什么还不动手？这正是马凯硕教授那个数果子比喻的精髓所在。树上有一颗果子，眼看就要掉下来，你何必费力去摇树、爬树？只要等在树下，它自然落到你手心等。 不是因为怕，而是因为根本不需要急。两岸的数字更说明问题。2023年，两岸贸易额仍超过2400亿美元，超过100万台商长期在大陆生存和工作。我们深知，经济融合越深，战后治理成本越低，胜算越大。中国对台湾的布局从来都是四德维度同步推进，经济上建立不可切断的相互依赖，军事上构筑难以逾越的代价壁垒，外交上持续压缩台湾的国际空间，法理上坚守联合国2758号决议。这不是某一场战役的得失，而是系统性的战略收紧，让统一在某一天成为水到渠成的事，高手下棋。从不急着吃对方的籽，而是让对方的每一步都在不知不觉中走入死局。中华文明在这片土地上走了5000年，多少强权试图割裂它，多少势力试图肢解它，最终都化作了历史的尘埃。台湾问题在中华民族复兴的宏大进程里，只是一道实际的命题，从来不是结果的命题。觉得有收获的朋友，记得点了订阅，我们下期见。